As we continue our study of the final hours of Jesus' life, we turn to the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the abandonment and denial of Jesus by Simon Peter. As Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas Iscariot came, leading a crowd who had come with swords and clubs from the Sanhedrin. It was after midnight. Judas came and kissed his master, a sign that Judas had given to the guards indicating which man was to be arrested. The disciples reach for their weapons, and Peter slices off the ear of the high priest's slave. But Jesus will have none of this. Luke, the physician, tells us that Jesus heals the servant's ear, while John tells us the name of the man, Malchus, and that it was his right ear. With this, the disciples ran, and Jesus was left alone with the crowd of thugs. The only disciple still with him now was Judas. Bound, Jesus is led back across the Kidron Valley and back up to Mount Zion, to the high priest's home. Now, while in Jerusalem, I found it helpful to make this journey myself. It was about a 20-minute walk for me, and going uphill, it left me winded. Let's get a sense of what this walk was like. This is the path that Jesus would have taken as he was led away from the Garden of Gethsemane and led to the place where he would be tried by the Sanhedrin at night. And so we're on our way up to the city of Zion, and we are passing through the Kidron Valley and to the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu. So this is the path. We've just walked through the Kidron Valley, where Jesus would have been led sometime after midnight with the guards from the temple with their torches, and he would have been taken up here. The disciples all had fled by this time, and when he comes up the Kidron Valley, he comes up the path from the Kidron Valley, he comes out right here at the southern wall of the temple, where he'd taught many times, and near the teaching steps, where he had addressed the disciples and where he had predicted the downfall of Jerusalem. And he continued the journey up the pathway to the lower city of David and finally to the upper city of David, to the house of high priest Caiaphas. It was here that the Sanhedrin was meeting by night so as to not anger the crowds. It was in secret in order to silence Jesus once and for all. Now, the old Roman road still stands here. The Roman steps, and pilgrims who come this way often will take off their shoes so as to walk barefoot on the path that Jesus was walking on, to remember and to mark that last leg of his journey to the high priest's house. And somehow, as I feel these large Roman stones under my feet, I feel myself identifying and really even just wondering, what was Jesus thinking? What was he feeling? Was he winded as I am after making this journey? Was he afraid? Or was he trusting once more in the God who would deliver him? The Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu marks the traditional location of the palace of the high priest Caiaphas and the site of the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. It's built atop ruins that date back to the time of Christ. As with any of the places you might visit in the Holy Land, we cannot know for certain that this is the exact location, but there are interesting features of this site that certainly help us to imagine what Jesus was experiencing on that night. So let's take a closer look at St. Peter in Gallicantu. These ruins, ancient mikvah, that is ritual baths and cisterns, are thought to be the remains of the high priest Caiaphas' home. From the earliest centuries, Christians gathered here and they remembered that Jesus was brought to this place for his trial before the Sanhedrin at night, and they remembered the place where Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. In 1889, this room was discovered. It had been filled with rubbish for centuries. And as archaeologists began to dig underneath the high priest's house, Caiaphas' home, what they found was evidence that there had been prisoners who were kept here. You see the place where the shackles would have been held, suspending the prisoner by their arms. And as the archaeologists began to uncover this place, they found evidence of Byzantine crosses that very early in the history of the church, Christians came here and they marked the imprisonment and the suffering of Jesus. Some even wondered whether he had been scourged himself before going to Pontius Pilate to be scourged, whether Jesus himself had had his arms suspended here that night and was beaten first by the guards of the high priest. And when we read in Acts chapter 5 that Peter and John were in prison for their faith because they refused to stop speaking in the name of Jesus, this may very well have been the place where they were kept in prison. In ancient times, prisons were often no more than a pit, a cistern or a dried well dedicated as a prison. People were lowered into them, and if you were to visit the Mamertine prison in Rome, where tradition holds that Peter was in prison before his death, you would find it also as a pit. Under the church at St. Peter in Gallicantu is such a pit, and it's believed that Jesus would have been held in this place from the time that he was tested and questioned before the Sanhedrin until he was turned over to Pilate. Maybe 5, 6, perhaps even 7 hours he spent in this dark place, in this pit. This is the dungeon, the pit where tradition says Jesus was lowered into as he was awaiting the outcome of his trial before the Sanhedrin. He could hear them debating his fate from this place. And as was common in the dungeons of the time, he would have been lowered by a rope placed around his chest, dropped down slowly into this place. He sat here in the darkness that night. And here we remember the words of Psalm 88, where the psalmist writes, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like a man without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." And one can't help but wonder if Jesus was pondering these same words as he sat in the darkness in this room. Finally, when the trial was over, the rope was lowered again, and he was drawn out from the pit, and the sentence was passed. He'd be turned over to Pilate to be crucified. All four Gospels tell us that while Jesus was on trial before the Sanhedrin, the other disciples had fled. They were in hiding, except Peter, who followed at a distance as they were bringing Jesus to the home of Caiaphas. Actually, John tells us that he was there as well. We focus on the fact that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times this night, but perhaps we should also remember that only Peter had the courage to actually come to the place Jesus was being tried. He went so far as to enter the courtyard. He was attempting to make good on his promise that though the others would flee, he would not leave Jesus. Here's how Mark tells the story. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the forecourt, and then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him again, began once more to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. We're standing here at the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas' house, the courtyard outside of the church at St. Peter Gallicantu. And perhaps my favorite part of this courtyard is the statue that was placed here in 1957. It's a statue of Peter denying 3 times his Lord, and the cock crowing above. And it reminds us, of course, as we stand in this place, that if Peter denied Jesus and was still restored, there's hope for us when we have denied Jesus, when we've turned our backs on him or failed to acknowledge him. If there was hope for Peter, there's hope for us.